Welcome back, everyone. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will answer them as we go along. And I do believe that Dr. Ledgerwood and Jody will be having space as well during their presentation, so you can answer questions, and so they will let you know whenever you can do that. So having said that, let me go ahead and introduce our presenters for this session. Dr. Ledgerwood is an associate professor and clinical psychologist with the Substance Abuse Research Division in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences. His work focuses on the treatment and etiology of substance use and behavioral addiction disorders. His recent NIH funding research has included clinical trials examining behavioral treatments for smoking cessation among individuals living with HIV and parents of teens enrolled in juvenile drug court. He is also internationally recognized as an expert in the study of gambling disorder. Jody Bechtold, LCSW, ICGC2, BACC, IGDC, and CGT, is a highly regarded gambling addiction expert, working extensively across the globe with individuals, organizations, and associations. She is the CEO of the Better Institute, a group practice located in Pittsburgh. She is the co-author of the Gambling Disorder Treatment Handbook, a guide for mental health professionals, 2021, and 2 chapters in the Social Work Desk Reference version 4 on gambling and gaming disorders, published in 2022. She serves as the Vice President of the Board for the International Gambling Counselor Certification Board, the IGCCB. Jody holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work and has certifications as a board-approved clinical consultant, internationally certified gambling counselor level 2. And when Jody isn't working, you can find her providing pet therapy with her dog, Hannah, and supporting her husband's business, the Pittsburgh Guitars. So thank you both for presenting, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. We are so excited to be here today. And our promise is that we're going to talk about ethics in a way that you have never had before, and we are hoping that you find it as exciting as we have put together. So we are doing ethics in the digital clinical world, very timely given the pandemic that we have just gone through and all the tech that everyone has had to learn, for some rather quickly, right? And so we are going to spend 2 hours with you today. The goal is that we keep the chat as lively as possible. And then there'll be times when Dr. Ledgerwood is going deep in some cases, and you'll be able to unmute yourself to contribute. So we're really looking forward to spending today with you. We just want to make sure you know this training is informational only and is not intended to give any legal or ethical advice. We would encourage everyone as practitioners to make sure that you're always seeking peer consultation, supervision, and that legal guidance for those specific clinical situations. And, today we're going to highlight some things that many of you might not have thought about in this perspective, and it might open up the opportunity for you to dive deeper with supervision and or any other professional guidance. As Jim announced, it gave our bios. This is me. I'm Jody Bechtold, and I'm really happy to be here today.
And I'm Dave Ledgerwood. I'm super excited to be working with Jody today. I've never worked with her on a presentation before. I hope this is one of many to come. I'm in Detroit, and we're both on the sort of East Coast, and we're about an hour different from you, but we're all in the same spot. So we're looking forward to today.
So just a couple of the objectives. We really want to help articulate the challenges related to privacy and tech use and anything related to health and mental health with clients and families. We are going to explore the current use of technology and any of the potential issues related to using them, mostly focusing on boundaries, confidentiality, privacy, informed consent, and competence. And we'll be discussing solutions for addressing the most common ethical dilemmas in gambling disorder treatment, both from traditional and modern technology perspectives. So let's go ahead and take out your phone. I'm giving you permission to take your phone, get it on the camera setting, and you're going to hold it up to the screen. And we're going to switch to a different window for a minute there. Everybody can see, hopefully. All right. Now, what you're going to do is you are going to take your phone and hover over that QR code until you connect with this software that we have here.
This is the most fun part Jody's got going for us. So.
Right. And what you'll be seeing is if you're not muted right now, please mute yourself just for feedback reasons. But what you're going to see as you join is we're going to have these little hearts that show up in the bottom right corner. So take your phone again, use the camera feature. You don't take a picture of it. You just hold your phone over the QR code and it should take you to the browser on your phone. All right. Someone's saying they don't see the code. Look at the screen. It's that QR. It's the weird little black and white boxes, and you hover your phone over that. If that doesn't work for you, you can also go to the website that's listed on the left-hand side, menti.com, and you can enter the code that's on the screen. But this tends to take a second for people to join. Is anybody having any issues?
My Wi-Fi decided it was going to.
I don't know what to do. I'm not good with QR boxes. I know I've got Dave, Jody, Tom, Angela. It says ethics. Now I just want to get the workshop. I don't want to do any QR code. Am I going to get the workshop?
Not sure why this isn't working.
I just want the class, and I don't know how to. On my smartphone, I don't know how to do the QR code. What do I click? The camera? Camera button? Huh?
You have your camera button and you hover over.
Now, what do I do? Click the camera button?
And you just you hover. If it doesn't work for you, that's okay. You can just watch. I'm just not sure why it's not connecting for people.
Oh, I got it, and I'm clicking it now. It's got little yellow things.
Okay.
And here's a little yellow thing, and over here's it says digital clinical world, and here's the QR box, and I just touch the camera. Okay.
Yes.
Like a little yellow box in there with something else. And
so here, people, you don't enter the code if you're using the QR, but this is perfect, right? So we're trying to use technology.
Oh, please don't.
And we're seeing how everybody's doing.
Not very well. I want to watch the class, get my CEUs. That's all.
This is a great introduction to the challenges.
Yes.
The digital world. I mean,
yeah.
These don't always go as intended.
My grandkids aren't here. I can't.
Okay, so people are having trouble. It might be because there's so many people on the call. But so what we can do, we might bypass it and just kind of go through and put in the chat.
Okay, what do I do?
If I go forward, does anybody see the question maybe in their phone? Okay, so some people are saying, yes, it's working. I see it.
Yeah. Doesn't work for me.
There we go. Okay.
Oh, I got it.
Okay. So first question, right? How many times have you taken ethics? And I think it's just real fun. This is a real-time experience. You're seeing people put in, I know a few times, too many. How about a gazillion billion, right? We all need to take ethics on a frequent basis to maintain our licensure and certification. And we want to make sure that we are adhering to our codes of ethics and we are giving the best care possible to those that we are serving. This is great. You guys are doing a fantastic job. Look at those numbers, right? Somebody put in, I don't know how many zeros that is. 1 gazillion billion, right? Yeah, several times, a lot. Okay, so you can see today our hope is that we give you new information because we already know, all of us know, you are not supposed to sleep with your clients. So we don't actually have to talk about that today because we all know it already. And we can talk about things that are more new and things to learn, right? So let's go to the next question. Duty to warn in my state, do you know if it's mandatory, permissive, not sure, have no idea, right? Other. And some of you are like, why am I having to enter this? I know for my state. Well, we're going to talk about using digital and why we would need to really understand duty to warn, not only in our state, but maybe other states. Good. Most of you are and I'm assuming you're all answering based on Illinois, right? With the duty to warn is mandatory. Good. You guys are great with the chat. 2 years into this, we're all really good with Zoom. I love it. Okay, perfect. Okay. Now, most clinical situations are ethical dilemmas and not clinical challenges. So I purposely put that in quotes because we're going to be covering the differences. All right. So we're going to see true or false, which one comes in ahead.
I love that they just keep going, just switch around up and down. True is higher than false is higher than true is higher than false is higher.
So it looks like we're not sure on this one. So we definitely have something you're going to walk away with today. Clarifying, this is good. Okay. You'll see in the training, but the actual answer is clinical challenges. Okay. One word to describe your confidence with technology as it applies to clinical work. I know one word might be hard to limit, but try and keep it as short as possible so we can see everything coming up on the screen. Good. And the larger the print is, the more times people said the same thing. So good is right in the center, means the majority of you are saying good. This is fantastic.
I love that everyone is also putting it, well, a lot of people are putting it in the chat if they can't access
Yes.
this. So feel free. Don't worry, you're not graded on this. This is just an illustrative kind of exercise.
So this software is able to anonymously collect information in real time. So at all times, we will never know who answered what. And what we like about that is it really gives us an opportunity to understand the knowledge level, the baseline of those attending the workshop. Oh, and that's a great comment. Before COVID, not good, but now it's much better, right? And I think we could all say that. Okay, so I have an IT or tech person on my clinical decision-making team. And that's probably a strange question for some people. Right? Right. And we would expect the majority of us to not have an IT or tech person on the team because we are thinking they are not on a need to know basis around with certain decisions. But today we'll hopefully challenge some of that approach and explain why. But good. Yeah, we would expect the majority to say no. All right. What does your informed consent include as it relates to technology and the client or patient? Right. So just pick one thing. And what we're talking about is the informed consent is what goes in front of the client. And what are you telling them about technology? Are you specifically calling anything out? Okay. Some are saying no. I would expect the telehealth rules. Thank you. Yep. Rights to privacy. Good. So think again, as it relates to technology, some of the other stuff we already know is in there. And I know many of us with COVID had to quickly blow the dust off of some of our forms and update them. So good. We expect to see a lot more. Wonderful. I was looking for that text or email somewhere. Okay. A lot of telehealth. Oh, good. Social media. I wanted to see that. Location, emails. Good. All right. We've got a good audience.
Getting some responses to HIPAA and other things on the text, by the way, and telehealth, privacy, and so forth.
Great.
Someone said, telehealth rules risks while using technology, text, email, and phone.
Perfect. Good. Encryption. All right. We got some good stuff. For the sake of time, we're going to keep going. I or we, meaning your agency, encourage Google reviews of our agency or practice. This is going to be interesting. This is pretty new in our profession to be talking about. Yep, I would expect many not to know. Might not be stated anywhere, so then we wouldn't know what the agency is encouraging or not encouraging. Okay. Many people are saying no as well. And the question would be, are you specifically told not to get Google reviews, or you just know we're not doing it, anything active? Okay. Great. And I think that's also going to stand out today. Are you explicitly stating something, or if you don't say anything about it, does that assume you don't want them to do something? All right, and that was the end of that. You guys did fantastic. We're going to switch back over to the PowerPoint.
I think these guys did spectacular on that.
Yes.
Once
So
it-
again,
once it
yeah.
going, it was a lot of fun. So
So hopefully you got to see, what your colleagues, kind of where we're at with technology and understanding how they are now intersecting in the clinical world. So we are going to, the first part of this, I'm going to go rather quickly as a review, just to make sure that we're all kind of in our ethics mental mind, right? And focus and perspective. So when we think about ethics, there's many different ways to think about it. We're looking at both the professional ethics and the legally mandated ethics, right? And what those differences are. There's lots of different models. It could be a theoretical or philosophical model for ethics. It could be practice-based, right? Based on our professions, or it could be specialty practice, which, gambling disorder would be a specialty. All of us have code of ethics, right? Social work, counseling, psychology, right? All of those. And many of those have similar codes, in terms of standards and values. And just wanting to kind of bring that together with technology and see how those all fit well together. When we think about the professional versus the legally mandated, we all think about suicide and the duty to warn. Right. And we know with TerraSoft laws, the professionals are required to warn third party if a patient threats their safety. We are familiar with, in our state, most of you said mandatory in terms of duty to warn. But what is really interesting is if you look at this map, and I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this, not all states are the same. Right. So the majority of us are in the blue states, which is mandatory. We will get in trouble if we do not follow the duty to warn. Right. But look at the green states. Those are permissive. So they are not in trouble if they breach confidentiality, but they're not required to do something. So we bring this up today because the idea of doing video or teletherapy across state lines is very appealing. And, for some, maybe there is, being duly licensed in different states based on, summer versus winter. But you have to know the states that you want to be licensed in, because not all states are the same. So they're not all going to be mandatory. They're not all permissive. There's even a couple that don't even have, right? Based on the profession, the different professions. So North Carolina, Nevada, North Dakota, Maine, right? Those are all unique states in terms of their rules. And as competent professionals, we would then have to make sure we really understood each of those states' requirements and adhere to them. So hopefully this was a new slide or a new screen for you all to see, because it just, before we'd be like, yeah, I'm just in my state, I'm taking my ethics for my state, that's as far as my geography goes. And it's a whole different playing field now when we think about serving people across state lines. And I also like to say that because we could get licensed in multiple states, we are then able to serve people in states maybe that don't have a lot of professionals that understand and are trained in problem gambling. And this, as we see the expansion of more legalized gambling, this potentially is one way to help with the workforce shortage, or what I refer to as the behavioral health provider deserts that exist in some areas of the country, right? But again, we would have to make sure we understand the mandatory versus permissive or none, right? And when we think about the various models, again, I talked about the theoretical or philosophical. Oftentimes, you're going to see this with more of that collaborative and integrative team, maybe more on the medical side, or you also might see it with dealing with aging, where you've got lots of different professionals, and they all have their own codes of ethics and ways of approaching ethical dilemmas. We could have them practice-based, like we talked about, counseling, psychology, social work, and the individual codes of ethics. Or we have our practice specialties. And just two examples would be like couples counseling, and what are the ethics and nuances when you're working with couples and families compared to what we need to understand with gambling disorder counseling. So lots of different ways to look at this. So this is why licensure has us doing this every 2 years, to keep it in the forefront of our minds, right?
Jody, quick question from the chat here. I don't know, we're not really presenting for Georgia, but someone did ask what happens in Georgia, just from the
sure. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
when you see kind of other, then you're going to have to go to that state's board licensing and make sure you understand through their regulations. Okay. And you're right, Cheryl, what does Las Vegas use if no duty to warn? Again, you're going to have to look at what their state licensure is requiring, because these are legal, right? And so you're looking at what's written into law. And so you're right, we're not doing this for all the states, but now you see all of a sudden you're like, I gotta learn more about this if I want to entertain the idea. So great. Thank you for those questions. And as we said, all professions have their codes of ethics. And I even put in here the IGCCB code of ethics, just so that you understand, even for certifications, there are codes of ethics that we want to make sure that we are following. And when we look at that, we know that there are ethical principles and there are ethical standards. Typical ethics trainings will cover a lot of the principles, a lot of the standards. For today, in 2 short hours, we're going to stay much more focused on the ethical standards and how those also relate using modern technology with like confidentiality and privacy and things like that. But we do know that all codes of ethics serve a purpose. We don't want to forget that. It's not just, oh, I have to do this training every 2 years, right? It really does give us that general guidance on how to handle ethical dilemmas. It gives us protection as a profession from any outside regulation, and it establishes those norms for our professional missions, right? And we want to make sure that these are the ethical responsibilities to clients as well as to our colleagues. And sometimes we forget that it's also our colleagues too, okay?
Jody, well, quick question from the chat, again, related to duty to warn, which is a very important and interesting topic. This question, does duty to warn include mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect?
Yes.
I think the answer is probably that mandated, duty to warn is a different issue than mandated reporting of child abuse and neglect. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, it also depends on the state, how, we've seen a lot more around mandated reporter in the last several years because of some of the cases that have hit the media. And so, you have duty to warn when they are threatening someone else's safety, okay? And you have mandated reporter when you are privy to information that requires, as a professional, that you notify and report it.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. Like as a psychologist, the duty to warn is usually sort of in reference to like tear off and
Yeah.
that sort of those standards, whereas protection of people who are vulnerable, like children or maybe elders or people with disabilities, depends on the state, but it can be, mandated reporting is a little bit different.
Yep. And who's considered a mandated reporter can change based on the state, because it's not just the licensed professionals. In certain states, I know in Pennsylvania, they have a lot of different individuals that they have deemed as mandated reporters, including in the daycare, the people that are taking care of children. So yeah, they kind of go together at times, but they are not one and the same. But keep the questions going. This is super, super helpful. So here we talk, remember the question about ethical dilemmas versus clinical challenges. This is always helpful for me to take a step back and remember, sometimes I think that we're dealing with an ethical dilemma because I'm used to that term. But I want you to think for a minute, the difference. Ethical dilemmas are saying that the information is complete. We already know all the information and there is an ethical dilemma. We know the values that are involved. We've clarified them. There are two or more standards, policies, or values that apply to that situation, and they can seem equally compelling and yet possibly conflict with one another, right? And so when we think about this, go back to the information is complete. For many of us, the information is not complete.
Good morning, Ms. Stacy.
The information is not complete, and we're saying, oh, I have an ethical dilemma, I need to get supervision. But really, the supervision is used to help gain all the information and determine if it's complete. So if we compare that with clinical challenge, right? Clinical challenges often are difficult or messy to, I think I just went past one, hold on. Little slow here. There we go. Okay. Clinical challenges come up with where the information is not complete and the values have not been clarified. And oftentimes through supervision, we're able to determine what the right course of action is, which is different than saying that there are two equally compelling value standards or policies, and we're not sure which action to take. So again, many of the things in our day-to-day clinical are often considered clinical challenges. When we have our cases and we pose some of the things to this in this workshop, as well as in the roundtable, you're going to see many of them are clinical challenges. Okay, so like I said, not to be a broken record, but most of those situations are clinical challenges. And we want to be able to apply the ethical principles, use the code of ethics to determine the right course of action to take. But there is a model. This is one of many. The thing I appreciate about this one is, like I said, we want to identify those ethical issues, principles, values, or duties that appear to be in conflict. Get all the information. We've got to make sure that information is complete. And then we need to seek consultation, so that peer supervision, any type of clinical supervision, potentially even professional or legal consultation might be required to determine then what are the options. This is assuming that there would be more than one option that might be in conflict with each other, and we have to then ultimately select one of those. And oftentimes this is where things drop off. We select an option, we do it, and we go about our way. But what we really want to do is we want to be very clear about how we're going to implement it. And then we want to evaluate and document the outcome. And so in terms of our professional duties, we want to make sure that we have clearly stated what happened with the option that we chose. And make sure that, because remember, we might have to present this later, and we need to make sure that our documentation reflects the outcome. Right? I don't know, Dave, if you want to add to that at all. There's different models and things.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I think, especially the seeking consultation piece is a big factor. And I would say, for example, where I practice, both in Michigan and a little bit in Ontario, Canada, there are a lot of ways you can seek consultation, obviously from your colleagues, but also I think, sometimes licensing boards or professional organizations also have people on staff who can answer questions related to legal issues or ethical issues that arise. I know, for example, my wife is a psychologist and she's part of the Ontario Psychological Association, and they have excellent resources for people to sort of address ethical questions. And taking advantage of those is sometimes a little scary at first because you don't know, if you put out an ethical dilemma out there and you don't know the answer, are you going to get judged initially? But usually, those sorts of seeking advice is actually, excellent. The people are really knowledgeable and accepting and everything else. So I totally recommend that.
Yeah. There's so many resources now. I appreciate what people are putting in there about the private practice listserv, group supervision. I keep saying peer consultation for those who are in private practice, maybe on their own. Who are your peers and how have you established that professional peer supervision with each other, whether it's formal or informal? I know that we have case consultations every single month for everyone in our practice, and it's mandatory that they attend. So it's just finding ways to continue to keep talking about this, not just about clients sometimes, but also about technology, right? And you're going to see that as we go through today. So what are the ethical situations that you have faced? So go ahead and put in the chat. What are some ethical situations you faced in your profession? And we'll see if we get some of the most common ones that appear. Right. And so think about, we talked about mandated reporter and how that might have played out. Have you, heard things about colleagues, other professionals in your region? Right? What are we seeing? Family member coming to my agency for treatment. That's a good one. I believe that Gretchen's your first name, right? Clients that know each other and live nearby. All right. Great. I remember I was so new out of grad school. I was starting up a new night IOP, and you know how hard it is to start a group. And we had 2 people the first night to find out that they were relatives. Never fails when you're trying to start a group, right? It's good. Family members with different last name. Okay. All right. Lots of family stuff. Good. Okay. Crisis work, rural community centers are going to think about that. Good. Accepting gifts. Okay. Social media. All right, Jeffrey, we're going to touch upon that today. Excellent. So you're starting to hit on those common themes that we see: the child protection, competency related to peers and colleagues, the boundary issues, setting the boundaries. And my favorite, right, is taking credit for someone else's work. We forget, right, when we're attending all of these different trainings, how important it is that we cite other people's work. It's very easy to just take a PowerPoint slide or a screenshot of it, but to be able to cite someone else's work, that's why we learned how to do APA citations in school, right? Perfect. These are good. Again, we're going to cover a lot of different ones with that intersection of technology. Not to say that these aren't important, but we do know that a lot of us have attended trainings that have talked about a lot of these. So if we take just a brief closer look at codes of ethics, we're not going to go through all the different codes. We're only going to focus on competence. And, this is a helpful one in the context of today's age of technology, the intersection of technology and our professional work. And when we look at the APA, what I appreciate about this standard is they're really saying to make sure you are within the boundaries of competence in the work that you're doing. and that you need to make sure that you only provide those services or you teach or do research when you have taken relevant training, education, you've had supervised experience, consultation, and or study, right? And so I love this one with gambling, because we're always saying you need to make sure that you have training related to gambling disorder to be able to practice in an area of competence. We go and we even look at the International Gambling Certification Board. We see that they're saying, yeah, you've already got the training because that's why you're getting certified, but now you need to keep doing that. It's ongoing education. And this couldn't be more relevant with the expansion of all the gambling we're seeing across the states with sports betting and all the online. This is why we're all taking so many trainings related to what's new in the world of gambling. And so competence is an important one. And so think about your continuing education and the things that you sign up for. It's not just about getting CEs. It's really about making sure that we are competent and delivering in areas, right, that we are most competent in, and being able to tell clients when it's not our area of expertise. And I think that that's something that's sometimes more challenging in rural settings or where there's not as many providers to choose from, but we still need to make sure that we do not step outside those bounds. And, I've had people way back in the past say, oh, I know addiction, so I know them all. And it's like, no, there's, when you think of gambling, you think of sex addiction, there's very different things that are related to the training of those specific disorders, and why we would want someone to have the training with that.
Jody, if you don't mind, I'd like to sort of make a comment on that too, because it's something that, for example, in Michigan and also in my research work, we've run into quite a lot. For example, in Michigan, the state program is the program of last resort. So you can only really get treatment from a state funded clinician if you don't have insurance. And so insurance companies will generally refer you to a treatment provider within their network, obviously, and almost none of them are actually credentialed to see people with gambling problems, which creates a huge problem. We also found this in a study. We just finished a clinical trial that was focused on co-occurring gambling disorder and trauma. And we were using a treatment called Seeking Safety. We were comparing that to cognitive behavior therapy, and we were providing that to people in Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba. So we had to use a telehealth-based intervention to do that. And I think this is a really important question from sort of a training standpoint. What happens when you don't have those credentials and there's no one around to do the treatment? I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I do, but I'd like to hear yours.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this, which is kind of why we're all getting into this profession or staying in this profession, is that we've seen such few providers that I had, early in my days, I had people say that they would go to their psychiatrist, teach them about gambling disorder so their psychiatrist could then help them. Right. And so this whole idea of the individual has to teach us before we are able to help them, then they deserve to get the right care and the treatment that they deserve. So that's kind of my advocacy piece.
I agree with that. I mean, and if we can sort of spread the word to folks who are in that situation, like providing peer consultation or peer supervision or peer support. Yeah. I know I've done that a lot in my work with like supervising psychiatry residents and PhD students who don't have this training, but at least can get clinical supervision around these things, right?
Right. Yeah, great. You guys are doing great in the chat too, right? That making trainings free so that it's even more accessible to individuals is super helpful. I know certain states, Illinois has been doing really, really well with that. But there's always room for improvement because the expansion of gambling is going to outpace the number of providers trained. So we've got to keep doing what we can to maintain that level of competence. Right. And so here is where the intersection comes in between technology and these ethical standards. So it's my hope, it's our hope that we start to go quickly through some of these situations to really tee up this conversion and highlight the importance of making sure that we are competent in the technology that we need to be aware of with our clients, not just technology to do our jobs. So this is very client or patient focused, and patient facing is what I want you to think about. Okay, so here is an example. This is one of several of the standards. The NASW created the standards for technology, right? And they purposely made it only about technology. And I, kind of giggle. It was 2017. I know ACA had one even before that, right? But it didn't get everyone's attention like it really should have, and it will get today. There are 4 sections in this particular standards, and you can see that the 4 sections, and that number 2 is bolded because that's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to focus on the other ones, even though they're equally important. We're going to talk about this whole design and delivery using technology, right? All the ethical, looks like there was a typo, sorry, ethical media, information and storage, the use of emails with clients. What about the use of smartphones? We all saw today when we started this, the use of smartphones just for the mentee. There's our traditional teletherapy, and then any of the software that we might use. So when I first started doing this training, everybody was like, yeah, I get it. Well, now it's different given what we've just been through in the last 2 years. Okay, so here, going back to competence, this is saying that social workers who use technology in the provision of social work services must make sure that they have the necessary knowledge and skills to provide those services in a competent manner, right? And so it's not just about disorders. It's not just about individual and population. Now it's about the technology itself and being competent. Because if we aren't trained, we could cause more harm without realizing it. And so that's part of what we're starting to highlight and see some of the complexities and where some things have become more streamlined. So with that, as my dog just walked into my room to say hello, the beauty of our remote stuff, I'll turn that over to you, David.
Okay, great. I love this little graphic here. So yeah, I think we're, segueing from what Jody was just saying, obviously technology is a huge area, and it's an area that's becoming more and more important. And a lot of the issues that we face with technology have been accelerated by the COVID pandemic over the last 2 years. Many of us have had to really change the way that we do our care and move to things like telehealth or phone-based or other types of ways of working with our clients. And so throughout the time today, we're going to be sort of intermixing some case discussion along with the information that we're providing. And so I want to start us off by just sort of thinking about some of the issues that are usually ethical issues or clinical challenges, as Jody's sort of been highlighting, for the most part, but also could have sort of an ethical sort of aspect to them. And for this, I'm just gonna present a brief sort of vignette. Let's see if I can move to the next slide. Oh, can you move to the next slide? So I'm not used to not having control over my slides. Sorry, Jody. So let's start off with something that might be a more common sort of dilemma that a lot of us might experience. And I'm going to read through this, and I know it's sort of easy to use the chat, but I want you to feel comfortable while we're doing some of the case examples, at least, to feel free to unmute yourself. I know we have a lot of people, 180 plus people. But if you unmute yourself, if you have any thoughts, you can just shout them out. I'll try my best to sort of sort them all, and we'll consider this an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. So here's an example of a dual relationship, something that could be a clinical challenge, could be an ethical dilemma. You have been treating Beth for a gambling disorder for the past 3 months. You live in the same small city as Beth. One day she tells you she just bought a new house. You eventually come to realize that the house is just a few streets away from your own home. Beth has school-aged children as you do, and it is apparent that her kids will be attending the same school as yours. Further, you volunteer for the Parent-Teacher Association at your child's school. After settling into the neighborhood, Beth also decides to volunteer for the School Parent-Teacher Association. This turn of events has the potential to be uncomfortable as the PTA meets monthly and has a number of social functions, including barbecues and get-togethers and so forth. And here's the technological twist to that. Most of the PTA members are also friends on Facebook. So given this situation, you can go to the next slide, Jody. A couple of questions for the group. First of all, how does this sort of situation fit with your professional view of a dual relationship? Would you consider this to be more of an ethical dilemma or more of a clinical sort of blip that you need to sort of deal with? And what would you do in such situations? And feel free to unmute and just shout out if you have any initial thoughts. I'm going to see how many of you I can see on the view screen here as we're talking.
Hi, this is Sam Miller in Chicago.
Hey, Sam.
It depends on how the situations present themselves.
Okay.
I mean, if you're friendly, you stay friendly,
Mhm.
and you don't cross that line if at all possible.
So if
Right.
at all possible, don't cross the line, just stay sort of friendly and cordial and keep it.
Correct. And
Okay.
if she needs help, it would be professionally ethical to refer her to someone else that you knew who could help her.
So potentially, referring out, if you're still seeing that person, refer them to somebody else and sort of explain, hey, our relationship has changed, obviously. And there's nothing we can do about some of that. So we need to talk about maybe transferring you.
I think that would be most appropriate
Okay.
from my point of view.
Okay. Other perspectives?
This is Patrick.
I have,
I
I
would
have,
agree.
Let's go with
I have
Patrick,
one.
and let's go with Patrick, and then we'll go with Tom.
I was taught that it's inevitable to have dual relationships if you're in practice long enough. And so the issue is whether or not the clinical relationship is affected either by myself or by the patient. And so the first thing is to talk to the patient about it
Mhm.
and make sure, like for instance, sometimes you were talking about families.
Mhm.
If you're in private practice, you likely may meet people you know, or patients know each other. And so the first thing you do is you talk to the patient about it and see how if they don't, how do they feel about it? And then I have to ultimately make the decision whether or not I feel that it's ethical or not to do it. So sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But the first step is talking to the patients. The second is me making the decision with consultation with others.
Okay. Okay. So talking to the patient, consulting with others, and making a decision based on the specific situation. Great. Tom, did you want to add?
yeah, this has been quite some 10 or 15 years ago. I had a client, non-for-profit, and that client would come into the office just for toxicology. That client was on probation for like not a violent guy. So anyway, years went by. This person was in our church, and I saw her. She saw me. It's like, okay, she was out of the program. She finished the program. Then she got married. Her mother was also at the church, and she became a very, she was in, in the church. She's still we're in the same church. And we see each other over the years. It's cool. That time is gone. I haven't even told my wife about this person. It's been like, it's like a big, we say, hi, how are you? And I respect her. Okay. That's all I'm saying. I respect her. And it never passed my mind or her mind to say, hey, it's like even I don't think she's even told her husband.
Okay. So then in that case, it's workable potentially. Okay, great. Mary, you have your hand up. Mary Crick? Oh, maybe not.
My name is Rhonda. May I say something?
Sure, of course.
Okay. When you add that Facebook aspect to it, that really bothers me because now you have all this private information that could just potentially go into the situation. So I
Yeah.
definitely think, with all this, there's just too much of a connection there where the client can know so much about the
About you personally, right?
the clinician. And I think that it's time to definitely, without a doubt, she needs to be referred to another clinician.
That's interesting. So there's so much in there, Rhonda, what you just said that I think is really relevant. And one is sort of, if somebody is in your life and they are a client or they were a client, there's some things you probably don't have a lot of control over. For example, unless you're going to move and take your kids out of school, you're going to run into her, right? If you drop out of the PTA, then that has an effect on you as a person. You're taking yourself out of an important part of your life. But there are things you can do. For example, you can say to the client, "Hey, you know what? I know we're going to be interacting on a different way. One thing, there are still some boundaries there that we do have to set. Maybe one is Facebook, right? Like not being Facebook friends because." And you could say it's not about you or me as a person or our relationship. It's about our professional relationship and the professional relationship that we've had, right? I developed this particular case scenario because this, in fact, happened to my wife and I over the years. And it was one of those things where essentially what we did is, we had that talk with the client. I won't say which one of us was treating the client, just for increased confidentiality. And the thing that we did was we just sort of kept our distance and kept everything cordial, as some have been mentioning. Both were involved in the PTA, but agreed to not do the Facebook thing, agreed to keep some of the socializing to a minimum in terms in more just on the level of things that were directly related to the PTA and that sort of thing. So I don't know if that sort of fits with what you guys think would be reasonable in such a situation. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts on that.
David, I would add, what's interesting about this case is the direction. It was a client first, and then the move, and then the school and the PTA, where we could see the reverse, where we are in the PTA with someone, we're on this private group in Facebook, and then they reach out and they want to seek services.
Yes.
Right. And so that one sometimes is a little bit easier to handle when the direction that it comes, even though we see that direction as well.
Yeah. And we were in the direction of, this person being a former client in the recent past, essentially. So that adds a little bit more of a comfort sort of cushion there. We could say, well, this is a previous therapeutic relation, not a current one. So you don't have to think about sort of terminating with that client and referring them to somebody else. But if they did come back and wanted services, in that case, you would want to say, hey, given our change in our relationship, I shouldn't be seeing you. I'm going to refer you to a trusted colleague, and we're going to do it that way, right? Any last thoughts on this? I know there's a lot going on in the chat around this case. A lot of stuff around boundaries. I'm sorry, I'm not able to get to every comment because there's a lot of really good ones in here, but I think the discussion that's happening on the chat looks pretty amazing to me, and there's a lot of good stuff going on there. So I can't really go through all.
It's a very relevant, it's a relatable case to many of us.
Yeah, and it's something, for example, I live in a city of 200,000 people. It's not a big city and it's not a small town, but people know each other. It's shocking who knows whom in my little city. And so you don't have to live in a small town for this to be the case. So great, there's our first sort of case, sort of what to do. We do, someone just said we live in a small world. We absolutely do. If you wouldn't mind, Jody, going on to the next slide.
Yeah, real quick, the comments, Lisa's been making comments, or Lisa, excuse me, about Facebook. I know people that changed their name for Facebook also so that the clients can't find them. And that would have been great to know years and years ago when people created their account and added friends and didn't think about all of these things, right? And so there are a lot of protective measures we can take, but none of them are 100%. So you guys are on it with what we have to do. Oh, thank you. It is pronounced Lisa. Okay. I usually butcher people's names. So perfect. All right.
Oh, great.
Next
So
slide.
there, obviously, I'm just going to sort of touch on some of these more specific ethical issues around these sorts of things, but and Jody's going to talk more about a lot of these issues, not all of these issues, but some of the things that we really need to look out for when we're working with clients that are sort of really proximal to the actual session, you know, when we're actually working directly with people, are things like texting clients, or things like using telehealth platforms, things like how do we allow our clients to pay for their therapy sessions. That's something that, you know, for me, I've never really thought much about this, but there's actually a lot out there on how do you have your clients pay for their therapy if they're not being directly paid, say through an insurance company or something else. You know, and also things like, as Jody was talking about, jurisdictional issues. For example, if you are working with someone who goes out of state, right? And just sort of briefly with each of these questions, which I think are good for discussion, you know, when is it appropriate, for example, to use texts with clients? You know, for me, I rarely use texts. I will use text maybe if a client sort of texts me out of the blue and says, hey, I'm going to be late for our session. And I'll say, okay, great. Well, let's touch base, or I'll see you when you get here or whatever. But I know a lot of clients, particularly clients who work with adolescents or younger adults, where texting is just like drinking water. You know, it's like so natural, right? And I know a lot of clients who work with or a lot of therapists who work with clients who do text, but there are a lot of issues around that. You know, I'm sure in terms of the chat, there are probably people sort of talking about those, but obviously some of the ones that come to mind are things like confidentiality. You know, how do you keep your texts confidential? Are texts confidential? In some cases, they are not. How do they become part of the client record? What happens if someone texts you at 2 o'clock in the morning and says they're suicidal? These are all questions that you have to sort of ask yourself. Are you technologically savvy enough to know the ins and outs of these issues? And are you able to sort of respond in a way that's appropriate to those issues? Does texting sort of increase boundary issues? For example, does your client start to expect that you're going to sort of provide them advice by text whenever they're experiencing something in their day-to-day life? So these are all sort of things that you need to consider, which can be clinical dilemmas. They could rise to the level of ethical dilemmas, right?
Mm-hmm.
The next one, which hopefully most of us by this point in the pandemic are more sort of conversant in, is what telehealth platforms are secure. So, for example, if I were to ask you, you know, is Skype a secure telehealth platform? How many of you will put your hands up? Would anyone put your hands up? I don't see any hands. I don't see too many pictures or too many screens either.
Lots of no's in the chat.
Lots of no's. If you said no, that's right. That's right. Can you just have your client go on Zoom and have your therapy sessions that way? Anybody say yes to that, or a lot of no's?
A lot of no's coming through. Okay.
So Zoom is a platform where you can get an account that has a HIPAA compliant health sort of license associated with it, where you can use that Zoom account appropriately to do psychotherapy. But the general Zoom accounts are not HIPAA compliant.
The one we're on today is not HIPAA compliant.
Right. That's why we're not providing any sort of identifiable information about our clients. Doxy.me. What about Doxy.me? How many of you believe Doxy.me is HIPAA compliant and can be used for psychotherapy? Any hands?
Yep. A lot of yeses are coming through.
Oh, yeses, that's right. Doxy is probably the most commonly used platform for telehealth, telemedicine, telemental health types of approaches. So it's important that you understand which platforms are appropriate, which ones are not. Even telephone-based psychotherapy can have its downfalls from a confidentiality standpoint. For example, this happened between my wife and I. My wife is a psychologist in the same practice where I work, and I was calling my client to have a brief discussion with him, and using my wired in headphones to my iPhone, and she turned on my car, and my car actually captured the Bluetooth signal and said my client was suddenly talking to my wife. Thankfully, she's a psychologist in the same practice. But technology can have glitches like this that can potentially cause you to cause potential breaches of confidentiality. And thankfully, that was not a big breach for a number of reasons. But you have to be very careful because technology is not infallible, right? You have to know what the limitations are of the technology. Even
That's a great example, especially when we were all at home working out of our home, and our family members, obviously would get in the car or something like that. They would rarely ever be near our office when we worked out of our office. So we didn't expect that kind of an issue to happen. But working from home, you can see a lot of these things. That's a good one.
It happens all the time. And also, a lot of us don't know that general Zoom, Skype, FaceTime, is another one that people may be sort of, tempted to use, but is not HIPAA compliant and could potentially be, put you at risk of breaches of confidentiality. So it's important to understand the technology platforms from that perspective. Even payment, this is something that I never really considered that much. Where I work, it's primarily insurance-based payment, but sometimes I have clients who are self-pay and they will pay by cash or check at times. And sometimes they would like to pay by, in Canada, we have e-transfers, electronic transfers to our bank directly, which I think is more common in Canada than in the United States. But in the United States, there are particular platforms that are HIPAA compliant for payment and some that are not. So for example, if I were to ask you, is PayPal HIPAA compliant? How many of you would say yes or no?
We're starting to get some no's.
Okay, PayPal is not HIPAA compliant. What about Square?
Nope, getting some no's.
Oh, you know what? Square is actually HIPAA compliant. Believe it or not, Square is HIPAA. It's probably the most common one that is HIPAA compliant. There are a couple of other platforms that are not as commonly used. One's called Ivy Pay. Another one's called Stripe Pay. Stripe Pay is actually not HIPAA compliant. Ivy Pay is. And so it's important sort of even knowing, like, if you're doing electronic transfers, because if somebody sort of is able to sort of intercept that and know that, okay, this person is paying for psychotherapy services, then you need to sort of consider that as a potential for breach of confidentiality.
Yeah. So we have a couple things here that, what about Venmo? What about Zelle? What about Cash App? And so, what we're doing today is really getting you to think, what about the product? Okay. But we have to really think even further than that. And I learned this years ago from Dr. Frederick Reamer. He does a ton of stuff with ethics and technology. And, Zelle is not HIPAA compliant because your bank statement could include the person's name on it, even though it's your business bank statement. And so the way around that is that you would have to get a release of information from the client for Zelle and have that in your file, right? And so, yes, we have to understand the technology. We then have to know, how does it potentially breach confidentiality? And then, is there a way to offer protection? And for some tech solutions, there is not. And for other tech solutions, there is. And that's really where all of this type of consultation is going to be so important, to talk on a case-by-case basis. So, yeah.
I agree. And I think other things like Cash App and Venmo are probably pretty suspect. I know I'm not very familiar with Cash App, but Venmo is not necessarily designed for paying for services. It's usually designed for transferring money to someone you know and trust, right? So it's not like PayPal where you're buying something with using.
Well, Venmo moved to that. You can pay a percentage because it's paying for services. But there was a whole social component to Venmo. And I had a colleague that I was doing licensure supervision for. And he said, can I pay you for supervision consultation with my Venmo app so that all my friends will see that you provide supervision, and maybe they will, because and I was like, that's a really awesome marketing and social media, way of thinking. And no, right? No, please do not do that. Right. And so it was even two colleagues, but someone that was of a different generation that was so comfortable with that software.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the final point on this slide is, can I conduct telehealth sessions with someone in another state? And Jody alluded to this earlier in her presentation. And, the answer that she gave absolutely is, you need to sort of address this by looking at your own licensing board, your own sort of guild in terms of you're in the APA versus for social work or whatever, about what their rules are, and probably need to examine the rules for telehealth in the state where the person is residing or where they're living. Jody kind of, I think, gave the example of maybe like snowbirds, somebody who might travel to another state in the winter, maybe going from Illinois to Arizona from January to March. You could also consider a lot of other possibilities, like a 20-year-old going away to college for maybe you've seen them through the summer, and then in the fall they go to college in another state. That person now resides in another state, right? Like, do you legally have the ability to see that person? This is an issue that's even come up with so for in cases where we've had a client who has gone on vacation for 2 weeks, right? So let's say I'm in Michigan and this client goes to Mexico or something for 2 weeks for a vacation. Can I actually do therapeutic services with that person? And it's really tricky, and you really have to understand the laws in the particular jurisdictions around telehealth, and your ability to see people in other jurisdictions could have huge implications for your licensure and for your liability insurance if something were to happen. So it's something you have to really sort of explore and look at before you agree to do anything like that. Next slide, Jody. And I think we're back to you.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, there's some really good stuff in the chat. Watching it, just not able to call it out on all the things. Some really good scenarios, like your husband is a truck driver and wanted to do telehealth and couldn't find someone because of those complexities. Someone else asked about a check and do I need a release from my bank, right? These are not just yes or no answers. You would then have to research, how does that appear on your bank statement? Does your bank create a copy of the check and include that in your bank statement? And then you would be able to decide if you needed that. And again, years ago, we all accepted checks and didn't think about this, but the banks weren't as savvy and with the tech and everything being online. So what worked 12 years ago, 15 years ago does not necessarily hold true today. All right. Okay. So when I think about themes, the reason I bring this up was I asked if you had an IT person as part of your clinical decision-making. And hopefully what you're going to see is that we now are realizing how much more we have to think about technology, the way we use technology to deliver our services, the way we use technology to interact with our clients is very different than it was 10 years ago. And so again, yourself, what's your level of competence? What kind of professional development should you be thinking about in the next coming year? And should that include technology related skill building, right? And then what about any of the interprofessional skills in terms of working with other specialists? So think about self and then move to organization. I'll spend a little bit more time going deep about this, but I asked about informed consent because I want you to think, what are your policies regarding some of these things? Social media, electronic data, and PHI. Are they consistent with your code of ethics, and are they consistent with your technology standards? And then who are the tech people that you should know, and how do you incorporate them, and when do you incorporate them? There are lots of discussion around, we want to move to a new practice management software platform. Maybe that's when you bring the technology person in to help evaluate each of the products you're looking at from their breach policy and how they handle a data breach, and how making sure that they keep things encrypted if it's cloud-based, right? So all these like tech words that they can better evaluate and say, of the ones you presented me with, here is the one I would recommend. So they're not necessarily involved on an individual client and specific client issues, but how do you get them involved in overall delivery of care to clients? And if you're, small practice, individual practice, this doesn't exclude you. Who can you bring in as part of your team, right? That understands the technology. So let's go ahead and kind of dive into informed consent. Now, typically when I do this training, I ask people to have already brought a copy or have it pulled up in front of them. And so for everyone today, just make a note that you want to go back and revisit your informed consent based on what we have shared today, because it's so important to say, what do we say about technology? Okay. We're going to look through that lens again of the standards for technology that we talked about. And specifically, I want to focus on social media, emails. David was talking about texting. What about location services and check-ins, and then the testimonies? And from this, we will then either have time for questions and really go into that. And then we have some others reserved for the roundtable. So we hope you stay with us to do that. Okay, so social media, right? And I say, remember the millennials and the Gen Zs, because understanding all the generations that could be seeking services at this time, there's 4, right? Maybe even 5 if you're working with kids now. But these different generations have a relationship with technology in very different ways. So we really have to challenge ourselves to think, if I'm not a millennial or a Gen Z, how do they think, and how do they naturally use technology in their everyday? Informed consent, think about what it says. I'm informing you of certain things, and then you are consenting that you have read them and agree to them. So with technology, my suggestion is that you put things in the informed consent. You specifically state things so that you are informing them. Now, that is different than if they still try and use them in interacting with you. Okay, so let's look at social media. When we think about this, social media policy, and this is an example that I've used, right? So this is mine. So you're free to screenshot this, give me feedback. We're always updating this. We do this every 6 months because that's how fast technology changes. But we specifically say to our clients at our first clinical interaction that we do not accept friend or invitation requests from current or former clients on any social networking site. Right? We believe that adding clients as friends or contacts on these sites could compromise the confidentiality and our respective privacy. It could also blur the boundaries of our relationship. So then we say, please do not text message or message us using these social networking sites, right, to contact your therapist. We don't read those in a timely fashion. If you need any type of communication, do so by phone, which is one generation, or by email, which is a different generation. Okay. And we really use those to talk about administrative things like changing appointment times. So we specifically said, do not do these things. So that if and when some of them do, right, we can talk about it in a clinical session, and we can document that we had a discussion about what was in the informed consent. So we're documenting in the event that somehow this does become some sort of a breach, it is documented how we had said from the beginning, please don't do this. That's very different than maybe in previous times where we literally thought that was enough to stop people's behavior. right? So we have to create these things that say, I'm just letting you know that if you do these things, I cannot guarantee that I am protecting your confidentiality. Okay. Younger generations are so used to using technology and being in so many, in the internet that they don't even think about confidentiality sometimes. Now, email, very similar. We use email, right, to arrange or modify appointments for our newsletter, anything like that. Please do not put any therapy session related content, because not all emails are secure and confidential. And we make sure as an organization that we have the BAA signed with our email provider, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee the client's provider and what they're using, right? And so it's really unlikely that someone would look at these logs in theory, but they can. And we don't know if that internet provider, would that be a breach? So we're saying, please don't do this, because it also could become part of your legal therapy record. Right. And you have to sit down with clients and go over the informed consent in your first session. You can't just send them something electronically and hope that they read it, because I know all of you read the terms and agreements on your iPhone or Google phone before you download an app. I know it. You read word for word on those agreements, right? So you can't assume that just because you put it in the informed consent that they read it. You have to go over it, document that you did, and then document if they violate it. Dave was talking about texting. Texting is not covered under confidentiality laws, right? And so we say to clients, you're responsible for the content of your text messages. We actually give you access through a client portal. We use Simple Practice, just an example, and you can do secure messaging in Simple Practice. All right. Now, I don't know about you, but if it's not easy and the way that people are used to communicating, they don't tend to go there. But we've provided it. We make it an option. That doesn't guarantee that people will do that. And I go ahead and put in the chat, how many of you have gotten a very long text from a client that was not text appropriate information, right? It will happen. Yeah, lots of yeses. Again, just because we inform them does not mean we prevent their behavior. It means that we have protected ourselves in the event that there is some sort of a breach. And now you know why the steps of document are so important. Okay. Find a way. If you're an organization, everybody might have the same way of responding. If you're by yourself, think about how you would respond. But I will say things like, this is not text appropriate, will be discussed at your next session. And that's it. I don't address anything in the text. Okay. So yeah, it's a constant reminder not to share these stories via text. So I'll just pause for a minute, David, because I know you were talking about texting earlier. If you have anything you want to add to this.
Absolutely. I think everything you're talking about is spot on. I know a lot of my clients I work with, for example, are people who are involved in workplace or motor vehicle accidents, and they're involved in insurance claims and so forth. An insurance company could, in principle, ask for any texts or any emails that are, could be part of the clinical record.
Yeah.
So, there's often circumstances, whether, if you're subpoenaed or other things happen where you might have to turn over all of those records, or if you're in a situation like this where you're seeing someone who's involved in a claim or something else going on, where anything that any documentation you have is part of the clinical record. I often sort of work with our PhD students and other, trainees that I work with, and I coach them quite a lot on how to write progress notes for the chart, with the eye towards like, this is a legal document, this is a legal
That's
record.
right.
But we don't often think about these sort of other things like texts and emails and so forth as being part of the clinical record, despite the fact that they clearly are, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was taught early on, and I love to say it all the time to myself, act as if you're already in front of the judge in all things that you do in your job, right? And we do know more so with problem gambling and gambling disorders, that we might be working with an individual, and after they are comfortable working with us and the therapeutic relationship is established and strong, then they share some things. And now all of a sudden we are part of a legal team potentially. And so again, if you always act as if you're in front of the judge from day one of all interactions with new clients, then you'll be like, fine, you can, court order my records or what have you, because I've documented them in such a way. We've had these discussions. But it's always a helpful reminder. We get fatigued, we get tired, and then we get sloppy. And, it happens to all of us, and COVID really hit us all hard. And so this is just an opportunity. As one person put in the chat, I'm going to go look at my informed consent later on, blow the dust off of it, see what it says. As I keep saying, put in there what people cannot do or what behaviors you're expecting. Don't assume that if you don't call it out that they won't do it, right? And so it's a little bit different to be much more proactive about these things, as you can. So I also did location-based services. I learned this from Dr. Frederick Reamer a long time ago. Hasn't been as much of an issue lately because we're doing so much teletherapy. But think about the younger generation that likes to check in everywhere and put it on social media. I checked in to get coffee. I checked in for this. I checked in at this microbrew or whatever. Sometimes they just have their phone automatically checking into things where they don't have to do as much. And if you're in an office building, maybe predominantly filled with practitioners like ourselves, you have to say to clients, be careful if you check in or if your GPS automatically checks you in, because people could make the conclusion that you're going to therapy based on the address and what Google has put on the website about that address. Now, I know that sounds like a lot. It happens, right? And so one little paragraph to cover yourself, to really just call attention. We're teaching individuals how to have a better relationship with technology as part of the therapeutic relationship. All right. They're not just coming for anxiety, depression, gambling, whatever. We have to teach them how to have those boundaries and have a better relationship with technology at the same time. And so then my very favorite, testimonials and Google reviews. Okay. So sometimes I'll say, like, write a few sentences in the chat, what you think about testimonials or Google reviews, or, challenge yourself. What would your Google review be of our training thus far? Right. Do I get 5 stars, 4 stars, 3 stars? What does Dave get? Right. And I just kind of playing on that, because again, there are younger generations that are so used to doing reviews and testimonials that they don't realize there's a difference when it comes to mental health, right? And I say that generally, mental health, addiction, all of those things. So I want to put that out there. I want you guys to think about it. We'll come right back to it in a minute. But have you Googled yourself lately? Right? So go ahead and Google yourself. And what do you find when you put your name in Google search? And I say this because this is what younger future clients do first. They don't pick up a phone. They go right to the internet and they Google you. Okay. And I've had people that said, oh my gosh, according to this, I have an obituary. I had no idea, right? Because of the same names and things like that. Other people say, oh, it gives my home number. Oh no, right? And then I say, okay, now you know why you need an IT tech person on your team. If your Google page has information you don't want on a Google page, we need the tech person to help us get that out of there. Okay. And that's usually the next question that always follows when we've Googled ourselves. People say, how do I get this off? Oh no, right? And so it's a good example of what future clients are going to be doing to look for us. What do you want them to see? be intentional about your branding, be intentional about the things that you put on the internet so that they see all your professional information, so that they understand this is someone that I can contact, I can reach out to. Right? Agencies need to spend more time with that. Dave.
There's a lot of great comments in the chat around people Googling themselves as in real time today as we're talking, which is which is great. You know, some folks, you know, just there are a couple of comments about clients being able to find personal information about the therapist, including addresses, things about colleagues or bosses telling people to like us on Facebook or other things, or other sorts of stuff, which I think just really backs up your points that you're bringing up about the fact that the internet is sort of the wild, wild west. And when you Google yourself, you're going to find a lot, you know, potentially, you know, you could find, as some people have said, there's like 1 million people with my name. So you know, it might be kind of harder, more needle in a haystack to find stuff out about you. But there's just so many different reactions to your question about what do you get when you know, Google yourself, and what do you know, so it's really interesting and really, I think, just adds credence to what you're saying about the importance of looking at what's out there about each of us, right? To sort of see if it looks professional and it sort of is accurate, right?
Yeah, and all you have to do is get help filling up page 1. Nobody goes to page 2, right? Think about your own behavior. Do you ever go to page 2 of Google? Or do you just change your search a little bit to stay on page 1, right? Good, there's LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff. Thank you, Lisa. The Google Alerts is fantastic. I have that turned on also. So anytime my name appears, I get an email and it says why and where my name appeared. So that's good, right? But again, we could go on and on about this, but this is why you need a tech person on your team. Now, you don't have to admit this, except to yourself. Have you ever Googled a potential client or even a current client, right? And again, think about how this applies to millennials and Gen Zs who have always known this as their go-to when they want to find information. It is not necessarily something you do maliciously. It's not something you just don't think sometimes between personal and professional. When we are training the next generation of clinicians, we need to be talking about this. We need to be calling this out, right? Because what makes it unethical is that it can change your view before you've ever met the person. You form an opinion, now you have a bias in some way, right? And we didn't have that years ago. We just waited until they showed up in our waiting room and we got to know them during that first session. So as I was doing this training in another state, again on Zoom, so a colleague to one of the participants was listening, and she rolled her chair over and she said, "Oh my gosh, I Google patients, families and their names to try and locate them because I serve individuals with dementia, Alzheimer's, and we are trying to find family members to get a release of information because the person has no memory of their family member or can't tell us their name." And I was like, well, isn't that one to stump the therapist, right? But you have to see, like, and under what circumstance would that be okay? And it really would be an agency decision, supervision discussion, and it may be a very last resort for unique situations. It should not be a company standard and part of policies and procedures, right? To be doing that. And so again, think about, is there a time to Google a current client or a client you had years ago that made the news the night before, and all of a sudden you're like, what happened to this person, right? So no definite answers, no rights and wrongs, but you got to remember this is can cause this to be unethical and have a different view of the people you serve. Dave.
I was going to add to that. There are often circumstances, you kind of alluded to one, which is, you know, if you see your client in the news or something like that, where it becomes very tempting to do this, to find out more information. I could think of times, especially my wife, who sees a different sort of clientele, where she's worked with someone and it's involved a higher profile case. And there's been news stories about that person's case, right? I've actually worked with motor vehicle cases where it was like a horrendous accident, several people died, and the case was in the newspaper, and you got to sort of temper your curiosity to go and look at what's going on in this circumstance versus the sort of that you don't want to sort of color your perception of the client. I also related to this are situations where, let's say, many of us are on social media and we may belong to certain interest groups on social media, and one day a comment from one of our clients might just pop up in front of us, right? Like maybe they belong to the same group and you didn't even know that they belong to that group, and you see some viewpoint of theirs that you didn't even know that they had, which has happened to me on one or two occasions, and you have to say, whoa, wait a minute, I need to back out of this and not be digging into this any deeper. So I think all these points are just super important, and they happen all the time. And
They do.
Yeah, these circumstances just arise constantly. So
Yeah. Yeah, you guys you're hitting it. This is perfect. It just is a moment to pause, reflect, and slow down before we get sloppy, right? So, going back to the informed consent standards, right? This is an example for social work again of making sure you discuss, right, policies concerning the use of technology and the provision of those professional services. Take the time to talk with your clients about the informed consent is really what they're saying. Also, you have to obtain client consent before you can do any type of an electronic search, right? And the question would be, when would be exceptions, right? Search for purposes of protecting the client or other people from serious, foreseeable, or imminent harm, or for other compelling professional reasons. Kind of vague. Going to have to really say, I got to do supervision. I need to seek supervision before I, do any type of an electronic search of a client, because there's not enough guiding principles to make it black and white. So I just put that in there because it is in print. Now, I put this in here also because clients, and we might actually like to recommend the use of apps as part of therapy, as a way of bridging between session to session. And, again, think younger generation, always no app. Millennials created the app. There's an app for everything when you think about it. And, at a different time, if you want, you could go to your App Store or Google Play and type in the word depression for an app, and you'll see all kinds of options. Yours won't look the same as mine. And while it may be tempting to be like, oh, great, better me or depression test, maybe I'll have a client do that. You cannot recommend and encourage the use of any apps until you know what the apps are actually collecting. Are they collecting any patient health information that they really don't need to? And my ongoing joke is, if you ever download one of those currency converters to go US to Canadian and, Europe, Euro and all that, and they ask for your birth date, like, why does a converter need to know your birth date? Those are those little signs that an app is collecting a lot more information than what it's supposed to. And do you know how these apps handle data breaches? So I can tell you that Cenvelo, was originally called Pacifica, does a fantastic job of articulating all of this. They built an app specifically to help people with social anxiety, and they adhere to all the things you need to, right, with this app. But others might just have created something because they thought it was a great thing to have. Some people have had a terrible first experience if they had a panic attack that sent them to the ER, and they're a really, really talented young individual, and they decide they want to create an app to help the other people that suffer from panic attacks. That doesn't mean they understand mental health. That doesn't mean they understand HIPAA privacy and how that is so much more strict for mental health than it is for even medical. And so just because apps are created does not mean that they are true mental health apps. And so only recommend apps after you have tested them yourself, and you need to test them for at least 7 to 14 days, especially with our clients related to gambling, because you want to see if there all of a sudden are in-app purchases that show up that trigger them to, with gambling advertisements and all kinds of things that happen with apps and the in-app advertising and in-app purchases. Right. So I know that there are some really good ones out there: Insight Timer, Headspace, Calm. Those are all targeted and done very well. But those outlying ones, you've got to be careful of. And, Headspace and Calm and all that, they're not free. And so then it might be encouraging to recommend a free app, but at what cost? There's always going to be a cost that you have to vet and check. Right. And so you want to think about these in treatment, not just general, but how do you use them for problem gambling and other addictions, and make sure about the data breaches. So the question here is, tell me, what do you know about WhatsApp? Is it something you could use in your treatment with clients? And if so, why could you use it? So what do you know about WhatsApp? WhatsApp is very popular. Good. Thank you, John. It is encrypted. WhatsApp was developed from day one as an encrypted app for communication. And it took off, mostly European, very easy to use over Wi-Fi. And that's why they made it encrypted from its original design. But I've had colleagues that create a WhatsApp group. So it's private group for their support group, their group that they run. And then everyone in that group is allowed to chime in through the WhatsApp. So it essentially allows people to text to each other in a protected environment. So if people are going to text, give them an environment that is safe to do it in. Okay, so that's one example. WhatsApp also had a video component that's really taken over with the adolescents during COVID, and therapy and teletherapy. So that's another example of that. Okay. Douglas said it's a wonderful forum in a protected environment, and it's free. You got it. You hit all three, right? So this is another a way of looking at how to use tech in therapy and keep everyone safe while using it. Good. Okay. So social proofing. Anybody have any marketing people in their family? Marketing people, social proofing works. It's the best thing ever, right? We got to get information. We got to understand. Yeah, you unmuted, Dave. Did you want to add something?
Oh, no, I was hit that by mistake when I was looking at that.
Okay. Okay, perfect. All right. Yeah. So you have a team, right? You have a marketing team that says, all right, we have some ways to get your clients, future clients, build up your caseload, any of those things. So I took this picture from my dermatologist's office. Okay. So take a moment. It says, check us out on Facebook to stay up to date on what we're doing and leave us your feedback on your experience. We want to hear from you. And I'm thinking, really? You want to hear about my dermatology experience when I get my skin checked every year? That's just odd, right? And this is where social proofing is showing up in the medical world, okay? But that does not mean social proofing is okay in the mental health world. And so we come back to this whole idea of testimonials. And it has been documented that if you ask clients for testimonials, either direct or passive, it could be viewed as undue influence. And so whether current or former client, right? And so many marketing ideas that work in other industries do not apply to behavioral health and mental health. And we have to be the guardians again. We have to be the gatekeepers. And so sometimes we might have a team that doesn't know anything about mental health because they're so good at marketing, and they're asking us to do these things. Okay. So again, I say, remember the millennials and the Gen Zs. They don't always understand that. Okay. So I am not picking on anyone. When I show this next slide, the point of this is that we're all in this together, and we need to have each other's backs, okay? Because technology happens so fast. So I took this from local to me. I don't pick anybody regionally now, like I didn't pick anybody in Illinois. You're welcome to do that if you want, but look at this person. They have a rating. Like, I don't know how in mental health you're supposed to have a rating, okay? But there's some inherent problems with this, because with this, and I know if you're on a phone, you're not going to be able to see this. There are ratings from 1 star to 5 stars, right? Best therapist ever, extremely unprofessional, see most man, like you can get everything across the board. So the second page, 1 star, 1 star, 5 stars. I could go on forever about the positive force in my life. I would never recommend this person, right? Like you get super hot, burning hot, super freezing cold. You don't get anything in between. So reviews really aren't that helpful, because it's one person's experience that they're sharing. It's not the same as what you ordered for dinner at that restaurant, right? And whether it was good or not. But the other thing that should stand out and be like, danger, danger, danger. People's names are associated with these reviews. Think about the breach of confidentiality. This is right. And so great, Karen, I always get that question. How do I stop unwanted reviews? Now you know why you need an IT person on your team, because it's going to keep changing, right? And I'll answer that in a second, but go ahead, Dave.
And say somebody actually noted that they are aware of mental health reviews on Yelp.
Oh, great. Yeah, see, it just doesn't stop, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you can really appreciate that if we have reviews, we've got to get them off of there. And the one thing I can tell you is that when your Google site is registered correctly with Google as mental health, you can prevent the ability to ever leave a testimonial. But if you're not correctly categorized on Google, then that's why you have this happen. Okay, that people can leave reviews. So I'm pretty sure this person has no idea that there are reviews out there, because that's usually the case. They don't know what is in the internet, even though we know that the internet remembers, right? So I hope that gave you an overview of the intersection with tech, and David's now going to pull it all together.
Hey, any questions for Jody before we kind of go and talk about some vignettes, some additional discussion vignettes? You know, Jody, you covered so much great information over the last hour and a half, and just so much of it relevant to everyday practice. Any questions? Feel free to unmute. I think this is the unmute portion from here till the end of our discussion. Feel free to just shout out your questions or anything else. So someone said this is a statement. You know, you can find reviews on primary care physicians on various sites.
Yeah.
So there are obviously some sites that are geared towards physicians, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, and you know, I think we forget that HIPAA was the most strict when it was applied to mental health, because mental health was the last part that was enforced. And so the medical side is a little bit looser than the mental health side is. So it's not surprising that physicians would have reviews, but we do not want reviews. Yeah.
Okay, great thoughts, great questions. I think we'll have a ton of additional questions when we do our roundtable, which is the next session after this, right? So
yep.
It sounds great, but for now, let's do some vignettes and have some discussion. Jody, would you mind forwarding? So obviously there are numerous important issues we've talked about many of these, most of them, probably all of these at this point, things like informed consent, therapist competence for using electronic technology, jurisdiction and licensure issues, dual relationships and boundaries, confidentiality and privacy, and safety as well. So we've got a number of different scenarios for discussion. We'll probably only get through a couple, but for each of these, obviously, each of these issues is complicated substantially by technology. For example, with informed consent, is our client made aware of the risks and benefits of technology when we do our informed consent document? Jody covered that quite a lot. Therapist competency, does the therapist have the technological expertise to understand the risks and benefits of using various types of technology? Jurisdiction, can you see someone outside of your area? Dual relationships and boundary issues. Does technology increase the chance of contact outside of treatment, for example? Something we've been talking about. Confidentiality, how does tech put confidentiality at risk? We've talked about numerous different ways. And of course, safety, how does tech increase risk to client safety? Are there even some circumstances where technology might be helpful to us in terms of client safety? So jumping into our first vignette here, we can kind of go to the next one. Again, another dual relationship sort of scenario. And I'd love for you guys to sort of think about these questions in terms of your own practice, your own experience. What do you think, if you had to think through this particular case, what would be your sort of thought process and so forth? But so, for example, you work at a large university practice in a combined clinic that provides services for problem gambling, substance use, and mental health issues. You supervised a student who was treating an individual with a gambling problem for several months. You have met the client several times, and he knows that you supervised his case. The treatment went exceptionally or extremely well with some ups and downs, and the client is currently solidly in recovery. The client goes on to receive training to become a recovery coach, and several years after you supervised his case, obtains employment in the same clinic where you work. One day, the former client friends you on Facebook. Sort of seemingly maybe deceptively straightforward case, maybe not, I don't know. What would you guys do? I mean, this is a circumstance where you went from a supervisory role to a professional relationship. A professional relationship in the realm of the where you sort of the realm where of his care with your former student, where you supervise the case, and something where he's actually gone through training to help the same people you help. What are the issues here in terms of confidentiality, in terms of boundaries, all of that? What would you say? I know we've got a lot of comments coming up. So
Yeah, most are talking about just reminding about boundaries and the informed consent.
Right. So remember, this is someone that whose case you supervised several years before. And this person has gone into a solid recovery, gone through training, and become a professional in your field.
But let me see.
Is this a case where you might be forgiven for making an exception to some of the firmer boundary issues? I don't know. The name here is Kay McCall. If you've got your hand up, go ahead.
Yes. What I would do in this case is, because even though he's a professional now, I still have insight knowledge about his history, about his personal life. So to me, I think those boundaries would be blurred. So I would just remind him. I don't think I would, even though he's a professional, but as a friend, I don't think I would friend him on Facebook. But if I came with him into a professional setting, I would maintain that professional boundary.
Okay. So maintaining the professional boundary, great. Other thoughts?
So this is
Dave?
Yeah.
This is
Dave.
Sam Miller again from Chicago.
Hey, Sam.
In some circumstances, if the person has been treated by this individual years ago and has come back and has become a professional. In some instances, like in the veterans communities, you know, where clients are treated for PTSD and various other ailments, alcoholism, what have you, and they become clean and serene, and they go back to school and they become a professional, and they are hired at the VA.
Mhm.
And that individual that is there, who may be a supervisor, he can keep a professional relationship, but he also may be an added inspiration or seed of knowledge for that individual because they know each other on a professional and perhaps a personal level. And, you know, there's no cookie cutter situation that works for all. Sometimes there are exceptions to the rule.
I really
That's
like
just
that
my
response.
comment.
I like that response, Sam. I feel like you hit some really important aspects there, in addition to the boundaries, which I think is also a very important aspect. You know, what you sort of added to that is, what if it's somebody who clearly went through their own journey to become a professional and is, you know, you sort of respect on a professional level at this point, and you've seen their journey, and let's say it's someone who, you know, has lived their recovery and made their recovery part of who they are, and they're out there about it, and everybody kind of knows where they came from and where they've gotten to, you know, and that they could be an inspiration for other people, right? And maybe then the boundary issue is something where you got to say, so what boundary do I set with this person? And maybe it's not the traditional, like the first case where it's like just a former client on the PTA. In this case, you're actually working very closely with this person on a more professional level and an even keel that might address some of the issues of power differential in psychotherapy, right? Because oftentimes we think in psychotherapy of the therapist having a level of power over that individual. But if that's something that maybe has not sort of become not so much an issue, right? That might sort of put us in a situation of saying, is this situation a little bit different? Douglas, see your hand up.
Yeah, I had this issue years back before it was blown out into the Gen X, the generation, and stuff like that. But when I used to work in mental health court and drug court, you know, some of the clients that were being assessed wanted to know my email address, wanted to find them on Facebook and stuff like that. And I was like, you know, I learned then not to do social media. You would not find me on social media.
Okay.
Because there's some issues and boundaries and stuff like that. And, you know, I've heard of people getting threatening messages on social media because, you know, they're the one that did the evaluation and they got them sentenced, you know, with the judge, stuff like that. So I try to stay away from that dilemma. I still have not been on social media, and my life is a lot more less complicated now that I'm off social media.
I understand that. I am. Oh, so go ahead, Jody.
I was just going to say, if you're done with Douglas, there's a question that came in that was really good. Doesn't the professional relationship expire 3 years after termination?
I think there's sort of letter of the law and spirit of the law, right? I think, you know, oftentimes it really, first of all, it depends on your professional, you know, like sort of organizations and your licensure and the sort of the ethical guidelines that you follow in your profession. So some organizations might sort of have sort of a specific term limit on some of those things, whereas other organizations, it might be a little more hazy, or it might be more sort of indefinite, that sort of thing. So I think that's one thing you need to consider is, what do your own sort of code of ethics sort of say about that? Beyond the specific code of ethics, though, I feel like there are rare instances, and I have to stress the word rare. And for me personally, because this is actually a case of something that actually did happen to me. So as a professional, and this is somebody who I actually have a very close working professional relationship at this time in my career, and this person is very open about their background and their experiences, that there may be instances where the lines are blurred, and there may very rarely be a circumstance where you might pick a decision that you otherwise wouldn't have with almost anybody else in your professional life. But you have to be very clear in your own mind about why you're doing that, I think, and addressing all of these sort of different aspects, including the person's privacy and confidentiality, the power differential between you as the therapist and your client. I think questions of how long it's been since you had that working relationship are somewhat secondary to those other issues, right? I mean, it's important if you stop seeing the person in therapy a week ago and the person's friending you on Facebook, that's probably a big red flag there. But if we're talking years, then those questions are probably less of a more of a secondary issue than some of these other issues, right? And also maybe having a talk with that person about, here's how this typically works. If we're considering doing something a little different, we need to understand this is not going to be harmful to you because you've gone through this process, right?
And my experience over the years with problem gambling is there just aren't enough of us. And so I view it as once a client, always a client, because we know that addiction and recovery can have relapses. And I would always want to maintain that that professional role with that person, so they always have that. And that's always been my spirit of, if you would say, particularly with problem gambling.
And that is tricky because it is such a small field where there's not many of us, for sure. Although on the flip side, I can also think of circumstances where no one that I've ever treated, but where people who have been in therapy, say with a therapist who was part of our state board, the Michigan Association on Problem Gambling, became a member of our board, right? And maybe their therapist was also a member of our board. And that is a very similar sort of dual relationship to some of the things we're talking about. And on the one side, you guys are sort of partners in this endeavor to help people with gambling problems. But on the other side, there's also this potential power differential that developed as a part of providing therapy to the individual. So it's something that has to be taken super seriously. And I think, as Jody's saying, it's such a small field, right? Other thoughts? Should we go on to this next one? So we'll do another one. We'll see. I think we're probably about 12 minutes out from the end of the session. So maybe we could do one more and save the rest for our round table. So putting a plug in, a commercial in for the round table, which is coming up. You're starting telehealth treatment with a new client. How would you describe confidentiality and the limits to confidentiality to this individual? So what considerations do you make when you decide what to cover in your limits of confidentiality? What are the consequences of not covering limits to confidentiality? And how can you ensure confidentiality using these telehealth platforms? What are the major considerations that you need to address? So again, discussing limits, confidentiality, boundaries, and everything else is something we do all the time in therapy. Some of us do a little bit more of a thorough job than others, but you add this technological twist of, okay, well, we're going to do this by telehealth. What happens, around the telehealth? So any thoughts on this scenario? Chat. Someone's actually talking about there are a lot of ads for gambling on television, so that's another technological issue. How many of you use secure telehealth platforms like Doxy or other types of platforms currently with your clients, whether they're gambling clients or not? Seeing some folks saying yes, I do. Are there any issues that you've sort of run into? A lot of people are saying yes in the chat. Any issues that you've run into with telehealth that you didn't run into with face-to-face psychotherapy that might influence limits confidentiality? And someone is saying, I feel it gets difficult when the lines are blurred when you run a group or an individual session. Group is a key word there I'd like to run back to. with video on a HIPAA compliant platform, and you're a mandated reporter, having a report that you see in the home that you report, say, I guess, safety issues or hazards in the home where there might be children in there. That's a very interesting question. So this idea of you're doing therapy with somebody who's in their own home, and you see something that troubles you with regard to someone who's vulnerable, like a child. Has that ever happened to other folks, or is that something that anyone else has sort of run into? And you can feel free to just unmute yourself there, and shout out your thoughts.
Well, and I think there's also during COVID, what we tolerated, and now post-pandemic, how we have to really tighten this up. I saw the inside of a lot of people's cars during the pandemic because that was the only safe place for them to be. But if that's still the only safe place, then they shouldn't be doing tele, and we should be doing in person. Right. And so there's limits to always offering tele when is that actually the right medium of delivering services.
One of the things that we do in our practice is we always sort of ask our clients at the initiation of a telehealth session, if it's a phone session or a doxy session, we'll ask them to where are they? Where are they at that time? And we let people know we prefer them to be in their home unless they can't do that. I've had a number of clients over the last 2 years where we've met masked in a room because they didn't have a private place in their house, but there were some times where we couldn't actually even do that. And I did have clients who would sometimes sit in their car, in their parking lot, or their driveway rather, in a parking lot. But that increases the chance that if somebody is in crisis or suicidal, that they may not be in a safe place, right? So we might have to, for example, know where they are so we could provide them with some assistance. If we had to call 911 or engage in other sorts of activities to help sort of locate the person. And so for people to know that up front in the limits of confidentiality, I think is essential, because usually what we do is we'll sort of let people know that if they tell us that they want to hurt themselves or kill themselves, or they want to hurt or kill someone else, or they tell us about child abuse or elder abuse or other circumstances that are covered by your laws in your state, that we would have to take some action to protect them or to protect other people. That might involve reporting, that might involve other types of actions, hospitalizations, and so forth. If someone is driving around in their car, that adds a huge level of complication to what we do, right? Has anyone ever run into that situation where they were sort of working with a client who might have been suicidal, who was in their car somewhere miles from their home, for example? And I see a lot of things coming through the chat, so I'm not sure if all of them.
Yeah, asking clients to limit distractions, making sure that if they're driving, they have to park.
Right.
Right. Where are they if they park? Being able to use, let's see, the whole camera. I know for me, it was always, I asked people to wear headphones.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And here's a question that is sort of, I maybe more on the extreme end of things, but has anyone ever been conducting a therapy session with a client who was in their car, who was suicidal, and you were quite worried about them, where you had to call the police and give them their cell phone number so they could find out where they were? How do you feel about that? Is that a breach of ethics, or is that a legitimate use of technology to potentially help identify and find someone who might be in crisis?
That's an intervention. This is Sam from Chicago. That would be construed as an intervention.
Okay. And I see some other folks saying it's legitimate if a person's in danger.
Mm-hmm.
They did that during, on a crisis hotline. But from a telehealth standpoint, on the one side, telehealth does put a person at higher risk of being in a situation where they might be, in danger in a place where you can't intervene. But we can also sometimes use technology like cell phones as a way to actually get help to somebody if they're in those sort of dangerous circumstances, right? So a lot of things to consider. I know we're about 5 minutes out from the end of this session. Jody, what do you think? Should we open it up for questions or comments? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think I would even add to this, you know, when you are able to cover an entire state because you're licensed in that state, geography matters, right? And so, you know, do people actually ask for clients to share their nearest hospital and the name of the police station as part of their intake paperwork? Right, because I know I can help people in Philadelphia, and that's a 5.5-hour drive from here. And if I dial 911, it's not going to be near them, right? So asking for hospital and police information is important if we're going to do distance therapy as part of our practice moving forward.
In our clinical trials in Ontario and Manitoba, our clinicians who are licensed in those provinces were usually in bigger cities, you know, in Winnipeg or Toronto or Ottawa or wherever, but they were actually treating people who were in the northern parts of those provinces where there might not be a large hospital, or there might, you know, certainly weren't very many clinicians up there, right? There happened to be casinos, but there weren't, you know, weren't necessarily a lot of gambling providers. So you're right, you could be sort of treating people very far away. We're getting a lot of comments, a lot of good feedback in the chat. And it's going a little. Oh, just got a 5-minute warning. Just looking at the questions here.
Yep, I've had that several weeks ago. A patient tried to do a video session in a car while driving and made them stop and reschedule. Good for you. Again, we're always role modeling how to have a better relationship with technology. And that's a great example of that. You know, some people just don't realize that multitasking, right, does not work. It's not part of the therapeutic process and relationship.
Someone also noted that they asked for where the nearest hospital and police station are in telehealth sessions when they're, I guess, when they're working with someone far away. Yeah. And a number of other comments about this, the last thing, like clients in domestic situations where the partner demands to be present, so what would be involved there. I often ask people to do therapy in a setting where they're alone and comfortable, you know, where they can feel like they have adequate privacy. I think in a circumstance, if you have sort of a partner who demands to be present, that's a bit of a red flag, and you want to sort of postpone that session and have a discussion with your client before you allow other people in.
Right.
I always, I've had times when people would bring their spouse to a therapy session, and usually, you know, what I would do is I would meet for a while with the client and say, so what's the aim here? What's the goal? Do you want this? Was this your idea? You know, a lot of those sorts of questions to find out sort of what are we accomplishing here, and is this something you're comfortable with?
Right. So there's a lot of comments here. Two things. Someone asked Dave if you want to go back and talk about the group work before we run out of time. And the other thing is, I know there were some comments about the pandemic, and my point in that is that while we can still offer teletherapy for so many individuals, we do need to think about those individual cases where in-person, taking all the protections we can, is the right thing to do for the client. So that was, I was talking really fast, and I didn't mean to just gloss over that and say end of pandemic. I was just talking individual cases to consider.
With the group stuff, I mean, you know, groups are challenging in the best of times in terms of confidentiality. Because oftentimes, you know, we ask group members to keep what we talk about in the session, but sometimes either through sort of accidental slip of the tongue, or sometimes if you get somebody who's a little, you know, more likely to sort of want to hurt somebody else in the group, information can get out. Well, if you're doing group-based interventions via telehealth, you don't necessarily know who might be off camera, right? You don't necessarily know who else might be in the room. So you have not only that initial problem, but also the problem of, are there other people who might be hearing the stories of people who have not consented to have those people in the therapy sort of room with them. So I think having very clear sort of expectations for group therapy is big. You know, it's hard to sort of guarantee privacy in those circumstances at the best of time, but something you definitely need to consider.
But think about group rules, you know, and add technology rules to those group rules. You know, again, like I said, must wear headphones. It is okay to do that to protect everybody else that is sharing in that group from being heard in that person's home, right? So are there other things we can do? But I know that we are now at time. So yes, the plug for joining us for the roundtable for sure. We have more fun cases to go over, some fast ones as well. But I just want to say thank you, Dave. It's been a pleasure to present with you. And I know that the last 2 hours, I had so much fun with everybody and their interactions, and, you know, a lot of gratitude, especially in times where other people across the globe might not have these luxuries. So it's wonderful to spend this time with everyone.
I loved all of the interaction, especially through the chat. I know when it's difficult to get discussion going with a huge group of 180 people, but it just really seemed to meld well. And Jody's presentation style, I think, is amazing. And, you know, I hope to present well. We'll be at the round table, but after that, I hope to present with you again.
I hope so too. It's been a pleasure, Dave. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And just a quick note for those of you as you're logging out, I'll just add another plug. Jody and Dave will be back for the roundtable. So I'm going to log back in and take another listen, because this has been fabulous, and you've really brought the joy and the fun into ethics, which, you know, can be difficult sometimes. So, you know, good job there. And for those of you that are attending, just a reminder, close out of this window, go back to your session access page and click on the next session so you can jump in and join us for that roundtable. So thank you all very much, and see you in a few.